The quiet hung heavy in the air, not the kind that brings peace, but the crushing stillness that follows when something precious has been shattered. Nathaniel Nate Carter dropped to his knees on the cold pavement, his palms soaked in crimson that belonged to another. Below him, Shadow fought for every breath, each one more labored than the last. The powerful chest that had once moved with such confidence now rose and fell in desperate, uneven gasps. Shadow's deep brown eyes found Nate's face, searching for direction, for some signal that would make everything right again. "Don't leave me now," Nate's voice broke as he whispered. "Stay right here with me, boy." A short distance away, two uniformed officers remained motionless, their hands hovering near their weapons with cold professionalism. One of them spoke under his breath, more to the air than to anyone listening. "Shoulda kept that animal under better control." Nate couldn't respond. The words wouldn't come. His world had crumbled. The familiar patterns were gone. And Shadow, his partner, his closest friend in ways most people would never comprehend, was slipping away. Roll back 24 hours, and Nate was simply another face in the crowd, moving through his corner of suburbia like background scenery. In this slowly changing neighborhood just beyond Washington, D.C.'s borders, few residents knew what to call him, but they all recognized his daily pattern. Morning and evening, without fail, he'd appear with his dog, a magnificent, powerful Belgian, Malinois that seemed less like a pet and more like Nate's other half. They moved as one unit, controlled and synchronized, carrying themselves with a quiet authority that made people pause and take notice. The locals had dubbed him the Dog Walker. But nobody understood the real story. Nobody realized that Nate had once served in the nation's most secretive protection unit, a hidden branch of the Secret Service that handled missions others couldn't even imagine. His job wasn't to be a hero or seek recognition. In fact, his greatest success was staying invisible. But 3 years back in Kabul, he had dragged the President of the United States from a burning convoy, using his own body as a shield against a follow-up assault. Shadow had neutralized the attacker before he could reach their escape route. Together, they had survived odds that should have been impossible. The photographs were never published. The operation was scrubbed from every official document. All Nate walked away with was his four-legged partner. Following his discharge, Nate had stepped away from the spotlight entirely. No medal ceremonies, no media appearances, no victory tours. He chose quiet, or something close to it, a simple house, peaceful mornings, strong black coffee, books he actually enjoyed, and a loyal companion who never strayed from his side. Still, despite his low profile and attempts to blend in, he sensed the watching eyes, neighbors who gripped their bags tighter when he walked by, people who avoided eye contact, the subtle tension in shoulders when he and Shadow rounded corners. Nate had been trained to identify dangers in deserts, forests, and combat zones, but this quiet, constant suspicion was more difficult to pinpoint, yet equally threatening. That particular evening, the sun settled low, casting golden streams through the branches and bathing the street in warm light. It should have been just another peaceful end-of-summer stroll. Nate, in his worn jacket, Shadow beside him, until the patrol car appeared around the bend. Before it even stopped, Nate sensed the shift. That atmospheric change that signals approaching trouble. 2 white officers emerged. One positioned himself against the open door, while the other approached with purposeful strides. "Evening," the driver called out, maintaining a casual tone that carried an underlying edge. Nate offered a polite nod. "Good evening, officers." "You from around here?" the second one inquired. "Yes, just down the street," Nate answered calmly. "Funny," the driver muttered. "Haven't noticed you before. I've been traveling. I work in international security, recently returned." That word, security, never sat well with people. It made them uncomfortable, especially those already making assumptions. The officer smirked. "Private security, right? Sounds like a dressed-up way of saying mercenary." Nate gave a quiet laugh, remaining unruffled. "Consulting, mainly. Risk evaluation, crisis management. I train teams rather than run them." The taller officer folded his arms. We received a report. Someone suspicious walking with a big dog. Didn't realize taking a walk qualified as suspicious, Nate replied, his voice still steady and controlled. The other officer moved closer to Shadow, who remained calm, alert but relaxed. That's a big animal. Is he trained? Thoroughly, Nate confirmed. For what purpose? Obedience. Protection when needed. The atmosphere shifted again. The officers shared a meaningful glance. One gestured toward Nate's jacket pocket. Let's see some identification. Nate weighed his options. He understood his rights better than most people. But rights don't always shield you when armed men have already written your story's ending. So he moved carefully, deliberately, keeping his voice low. Of course. As he reached for his wallet, Shadow adjusted slightly with him, just enough to draw attention. Control your animal, one officer barked. He's fine, Nate said. He's trained to follow my movements. They weren't interested in explanations. They didn't want calm. They wanted dominance. Nate extended his ID. The officer barely glanced at it before nodding toward their vehicle. We need to ask you more questions. I've answered what I can, Nate responded. Then you shouldn't mind coming over here? Actually, I do mind. I haven't violated any laws. That was the breaking point. The shorter officer stepped forward, his voice sharp with authority. Turn around. Hands behind your back. Shadow moved again, more focused now, instinctively positioning himself between Nate and the perceived threat. A low growl emerged. Not aggressive, simply a warning. And that's when the weapon appeared. The gunshot shattered the evening calm like breaking glass. Shadow collapsed immediately. Nate didn't resist. Not to fight back, not to flee. He simply dropped to his knees. The leash went limp. Blood spread quickly. His hands pressed against the dog's side, applying useless pressure to the wound. He spoke his name softly, once, then again, and again. Hours later in the station, he sat under harsh fluorescent lighting, the metallic scent of dried blood still clinging to his clothing. The officers completed their paperwork. No arrests, no regrets, just cold procedure. Then, a new voice cut through the room. Crisp, female, furious. Release him immediately. Mariana Carter didn't wait for permission. She was pure determination in heels and a sharp suit, storming in with authority no one dared question. You shot his dog and detained him for what? Walking while black? Her words sliced through the space like a razor. Nate remained silent until they reached the parking lot. The stars above seemed blurred. His voice was quiet, exhausted. They didn't even see him. He was just a threat to them. Mariana placed her hand on his shoulder. We'll file complaints. I'll use every connection I have. Nate shook his head. They'll cover it up like they always do. Back home he sat alone, next to the empty bed where Shadow used to rest. The collar still carried his scent. He traced his thumb along the weathered leather, each mark holding a memory. Their first assignment. The night Shadow warned him about an explosive device. The moment he pulled Nate from the debris, they hadn't just killed a dog. They'd destroyed the last piece of his former life that still held meaning. The following morning, Nate studied his reflection in the mirror, his expression calm but unreadable. He picked up the collar and slowly wound it around his hand. It felt like both a weapon and a vow. They didn't know his identity, but they would learn. And this time, he wasn't going to fade away quietly. The morning following Shadow's death, the neighborhood seemed unnaturally quiet, as if even the trees and buildings were afraid to breathe. Nate Carter sat in his kitchen, untouched breakfast. Growing cold beside a steaming mug of black coffee he couldn't bring himself to drink. His fingers moved slowly across Shadow's collar, feeling every worn spot in the leather, listening to the soft chime of the metal tag. Everything in his house remained exactly where it belonged. Books organized by topic, floors spotless, window, blinds positioned just so. But it no longer felt like home. It felt like a photograph someone had forgotten to put away. Mariana had tried calling 3 times since dawn. Each time he watched the phone ring until the screen darkened. He wasn't ready for words yet. Not for her, not for anyone. What he possessed now was focus, the kind he hadn't felt since his final mission. Focus is dangerous in someone trained for combat. But in someone who has already sacrificed everything once and lost what little remained, it becomes fire. That evening, Nate positioned himself in the dim corner of a small tavern on the city's east side, sipping club soda while keeping. His eyes locked on the man celebrating at the far end of the bar. Officer Roberto Hayes, one of the two who had stood over Shadow's body like it was garbage on the street, now sat with his back to everyone, carefree, as if the incident had been erased from history. He slapped the bartender's back, flirted loudly with a woman young enough to be his daughter, knocked back shots like someone who believed his badge would always protect him. Nate had been observing for 3 days. Roberto followed the same patterns, drank excessively, took the same back alley to the rear parking area, left his car where security cameras couldn't see. Too simple. But this wasn't about violence. Not yet. This was about fear. A lesson that some men couldn't be trampled without consequences. When Roberto stumbled through the back exit just past midnight, Nate was waiting in the shadows, leaning against the brick wall with his hood pulled low. Roberto fumbled with his keys, swearing under his breath, then froze when a voice emerged from the darkness like grinding stone. "Ever wonder what it feels like to be prey, officer?" Roberto spun around, squinting into the shadows, but the attack came too quickly. Not with a weapon, with a message, a strike to the stomach, a twist of the arm, a quick trip to the pavement. Nate crouched close, speaking directly into the man's ear with a voice cold as winter frost. "I'm not here to end you. I'm here to introduce you to something you don't understand. Consequences." Then he vanished, silent, clean, leaving only bruises and terror behind. The next morning, word spread quietly through law enforcement circles. An unknown attacker had assaulted an officer. No footage, no witnesses. Roberto claimed it was gang-related, but his eyes, wide and paranoid, told a different story. Nate observed from a safe distance as the department panicked. The attack had shaken them. That was the goal. But Nate wasn't finished. Fear was just the opening move. He returned home that night and began constructing what he called the network. A complex web of names, addresses, evidence, and connections. Every brutality complaint linked to those 2 officers. Every person they'd harmed. Every victim who'd tried to speak up and been silenced. He uncovered old legal documents, cell phone footage hidden in cloud storage, witness testimonies that had never reached courtrooms. His house transformed into part command center, part memorial. Shadow's collar remained on the desk, a silent observer to every plan, every strategy. Meanwhile, Mariana pursued justice through traditional channels. She submitted official complaints, contacted media allies, reached out to oversight organizations, but her calls were returned slowly, if ever. The system crawled forward when it moved at all. "They've already concluded the internal review," she informed Nate during a tense visit. Both officers were cleared. They labeled it appropriate response to perceived threat. Nate said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. Days later, Nate shadowed the second officer, Luis Moreno, through his daily routine. Luis was more cautious, less flashy than Roberto. He kept a low profile, but he had patterns too. Nate followed him through side streets and private fitness centers, coffee shops where he met with others who wore identical badges, but shared the same arrogance. Nate documented everything. He placed a small tracking device on Luis's vehicle, just enough to monitor routes, not violate privacy. He wasn't breaking laws. Not yet. But each step brought him closer to that line. Then came the unexpected connection. One of the men, Luis, met with, a former boxing trainer named Marcos, was someone Nate recognized, not from military service, but from the neighborhood, a man who had once challenged police after being beaten during a false arrest. His case had been thrown out, his voice suppressed. Nate approached him one evening outside the gym. No intimidation, no posturing, just a simple question. If you had another chance to tell your story, would you? Marco studied him, eyes narrowing. Depends who's listening. Nate handed him a USB drive. They will be soon. That night, Marcos's testimony went live. Raw, unfiltered, recorded in the soft lighting of Nate's study, filled with quiet anger and truth. The video exploded across social media within hours. Mariana called in amazement. "What have you done?" Nate simply answered, "Given them something to experience." The department scrambled. Public statements, half-hearted apologies, but nothing substantial. No real action. Nate realized it was time to escalate. He lured Luis and Roberto to his house under false circumstances. Just a neighborly visit, they claimed. He left the gate unlocked, placed documents visibly on tables, made the space appear vulnerable. He allowed them to push him around. Let them make threats in the quiet. Let the cameras hidden behind vents and fixtures record every moment. When they departed, laughing, believing they had re-established control, Nate uploaded the footage. Not to news outlets, but to the entire world. By morning, the narrative had changed completely. Not just another black man complaining about police, but a former elite operative. A man who had once stood between the president and death. A man who had remained quiet too long and now possessed evidence. The footage aired nationally. Luis and Roberto were suspended within hours. Investigations reopened. Protests emerged. Not angry, but determined. Nate watched from his front porch, arms crossed, Shadow's collar in his palm. When Mariana arrived with tears in her eyes, she didn't speak. She didn't need to. She stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. They had chosen different roads to justice. But now, for the first time, those roads had converged. The world had shifted. In just days, what started as a quiet, solitary act of grief had evolved into a movement. Nate Carter's footage spread across networks and social platforms like wildfire, not just because of what it revealed, but because of who he was. It wasn't simply the image of a decorated veteran being pushed around by two arrogant officers. It was the irony. A man who had once protected the President of the United States, now needing protection from the very system he had once trusted with his life. The public responded. Veterans stepped forward. Reporters investigated deeper. Names surfaced. Cases reopened. Suddenly, people who had been invisible became visible. But Nate hadn't done this for fame. He had done it because they murdered his friend, and he understood that justice doesn't arrive unless you invite it in, and sometimes you have to force the door open. The courtroom felt colder than anticipated, modern, sterile, buzzing with controlled tension. Nate sat quietly near the front, not as a defendant or witness that day, but as a presence, a reminder. He wore a charcoal suit, pressed and simple, but his real protection was in his bearing. Still, steady, undeniable. Mariana stood beside him, reviewing documents, her expression unreadable but burning with focused determination. Across the room, Luis and Roberto shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They looked different now, not confident or cocky, but worn down. Public disgrace does that to people. When their names were called and charges read, unlawful conduct, abuse of authority, civil rights violations, they winced, not because they hadn't expected it, but because they no longer believed they were above consequences. Nate didn't celebrate. This wasn't victory. This was accountability, a first step. Justice, in his experience, was rarely quick and never simple. It was a series of difficult, painful adjustments stretched across weeks, months, years. But this was progress. It was happening. When the judge called for a break, Nate stepped outside, letting sunlight warm his face. The crowd outside the courthouse cheered when they spotted him, and he nodded respectfully, but didn't wave. He wasn't there for recognition. He was thinking of Shadow, how his ears would perk up when the breeze changed, how he would sit perfectly motionless beside Nate at any public event, like a soldier awaiting commands. He felt the emptiness, like a wound in his chest, but the warmth of that memory, even in sadness, anchored him. Later that evening, back home, Nate opened an envelope that had been quietly delivered earlier that day. Inside was an official letter bearing the seal of the United States government, a commendation, delayed but genuine, recognizing his actions years ago in Afghanistan during the mission that had saved the president's life. The letter concluded with a line that read, "We apologize that this recognition comes so late. Some heroes serve in shadows. Others rise when duty calls again." Nate set it aside. He didn't need awards. He never had. But there was something meaningful about receiving that letter now, after everything. That night, Mariana joined him for dinner. They ate in comfortable silence, two people finally able to breathe easier. She looked around the house, noticing its simplicity. "You've never really changed this place?" she observed. Nate smiled slightly. "Didn't see the need. Shadow didn't care." Her expression softened. "What's next for you?" Nate leaned back in his chair. "There's something I've been considering." 2 weeks later, in a quiet corner lot just outside the city, construction began on a modest facility. Nothing flashy, no signs declaring patriotism or revenge, just a clean, functional space with open grounds and reinforced training areas. It would be a center for training service dogs, real ones, for veterans dealing with trauma, for first responders recovering from injuries, for those who needed more than traditional therapy. It would be called the Shadow Program, not named for the pain, but for the loyalty, the connection, the protection without conditions. Nate didn't announce. It on television. He didn't grant interviews. But word traveled, and slowly people arrived. Some brought dogs who had lost their purpose. Others brought memories they hadn't shared aloud in years. They came because they recognized something they had almost forgotten: strength without noise, leadership without ego, grief without surrender. Meanwhile, the legal process continued. Mariana pushed forward, ensuring the system didn't simply bury everything again. She worked behind the scenes, gathering others, activists, attorneys, journalists, who now saw an opportunity to advocate for broader reform. Nate supported her, but from a distance. His days were filled with the rhythm of work, training, structure, effort. At night he sat with a quiet cup of tea and watched the stars, wondering if somewhere beyond the silence, Shadow was still standing guard. Months passed. A verdict arrived. Both officers were found guilty, not just of misconduct, but of systematic abuse, negligence, and falsifying reports. Their sentences weren't as long as some would have preferred, but they were real. Their names would no longer be whispered with fear, but remembered for the boundary they crossed and the man who redrew it. On the 1-year anniversary of Shadow's death, Nate held a small gathering at the training center. Former trainees attended. Families who had adopted service dogs through the program stood with pride. Mariana delivered a brief speech, her voice strong and clear. But it was Nate who, standing last, held the collar in his hand and spoke the words that truly counted. "This isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility. It's about never letting anyone tell you that you or those you love don't matter. Shadow stood beside me every day, never seeking praise, simply doing his duty. This is for him. And for anyone who's ever been silenced, overlooked, or forgotten, you are not alone." When the applause faded, a quiet hush settled over the group, not mournful, but powerful. They understood, because what Nate had accomplished wasn't just about reclaiming dignity. It was about restoring it for everyone like him, those who had served, sacrificed, and returned to a world that didn't see them. Now, at least in this corner of it, they were seen, heard, valued. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned the soft orange of closure, Nate walked the outer grounds of the center. A new puppy trotted beside him, ears too large for its head, eyes full of promise. He wasn't replacing Shadow. No one ever could. But he was opening the door again, to healing, to purpose, to tomorrow, and tomorrow was waiting.